This is Jennifer Nicoll Victor. As most of you know, my daughter. So Jennifer, I'm just going to let you introduce yourself and go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, thanks, Mom. It's a pleasure to be here. I get asked to do voter talks all the time, but I've never done one for the League of Women Voters or for any of the organizations my mom's involved with. So this is a great privilege for me. Just to introduce myself, I am a political scientist. I'm associate professor of political science at the Schaar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, which is in Fairfax, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. I've been on faculty here since 2012. Before that, I was on faculty for about 8 or 9 years at the University of Pittsburgh, also in political science. I've done a short fellowship on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Senate in 2005. I do some work with nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations. For example, I serve on the board of directors of the Center for Responsive Politics, which deals with campaign finance transparency. My area of research is primarily around US Congress and political parties and campaign finance and lobbying and so forth, and other aspects of US politics that are a little bit broken, which we're going to talk about. So I'm very pleased to be here. I teach classes on all of these areas, including also in political methodology and statistics and social networks. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my, my screen to start the slideshow. And I'll also start by admitting that I have planned entirely too much information to share with you today. And so some things that I talk about I might go through more rapidly than you'd like, in which case, feel free to log that question down and we can come back to it in the Q&A. But there's a lot to cover and sometimes it's hard to figure out how to focus. And I've been told really lovely things about the level of curiosity of this group. And so I figured it was okay to be a little bit ambitious with the presentation. Okay, so let me just introduce the topic that I'm going to talk about today. This is how can elections save us? So I'm going to put this into 3 broad themes. So the first one is, do we need saving? Like that, the question alone at the title of the talk is a little bit off-putting perhaps, or jarring. So do we need saving? And if so, what do we need saving from? So I'm going to try to put a little context on that at the outset. And then I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what makes 2020 different. Some things that you are already familiar with, but going to try to go a little bit deeper on some of those topics. And then finally, the crux of the question at the outline of the talk here is to try to get at the purpose of voting in elections. And if we understand what elections and voting are for, can that help us understand what they're able to accomplish in a democratic context? All right, so this is all where we're going. So let me start with, do we need saving and from what? So there's a group of political scientists up at Dartmouth University that since 2017 have been involved with this project called Bright Line Watch. And Bright Line Watch they do a series of surveys, mostly among experts. So they do regular surveys of political scientists and historians and legal scholars and all sorts of others. They have a very large panel survey that's going on for these number of years, and they're just trying to take the temperature about how experts think US democracy is doing. And I apologize for the size of the font in these graphs. I didn't make them, Bright Line Watch did. But what this first graph here is showing is that experts, if we look at how experts evaluate democracy since about 1800, so over the last 220 some odd years, it seems like mostly we've had an upward trajectory of democracy. You can see the largest slope there. The steepest slope we get is between about 1960 and 1975, in that period through the US civil rights movement and other political rights movements. But then you can also observe a bit of a downturn since about the mid-1990s. And experts have seen a backslide in the health of democracy. And so if we dig in on that a little bit and we just look at how this group has evaluated and how the experts have evaluated democracy just over the last 3 years. So since April of 2017, in this modern era, experts evaluate US democracy as being essentially on its weakest footing over this 3-year period. So about 60% of experts will put US democracy on a reasonable footing, but that number has been slightly going down. This is a pretty large sample, so there are, those bars there are 95% confidence intervals, and if that means anything to you, that tells you that the changes across time are significant. But what does that mean? What does democracy mean? That's a big question I'm not going to fully answer today. But what are the experts most concerned about? What are they picking up on? And so there's a number of things that we can look at here. And I'm not going to talk about all of these. I want to zone in on a few. But among the items that experts are most concerned about, so the things at the top of the graph there are things that experts are saying the US democracy is mostly meeting these expectations about voting and elections and parties and candidate choice and so forth. But the things at the bottom are the things that are sort of greatest concern. So, and we can kind of put these into a couple of different categories. So we could talk about areas related to elections and voting. So experts are concerned about districts being biased, about participation levels, about votes having equal impact. There's also a fair amount of concern related to the information environment, that there's a common understanding of facts that is generally lacking in American society today. And then another one that's of great concern to a lot of scholars is the idea of democratic norms, that the patriotism gets questioned, that compromise is not sought among political rivals, or that there's no sanctions for misconduct among elected elites. And so all of these are categories that we can dive into a little bit deeper, but what it says to us is that there is reason to be really concerned about the sort of precarious nature and the uncertainties associated with the health of the stability of the government where we are right now. Okay, so one of the other things that political scientists talk about, and one of the things that I just brought up in that graph, sort of the green thing, was about democratic norms. So what do we mean when we talk about democratic norms? So here I'm going to draw on a book that was published a couple of years ago with a foreboding title called How Democracies Die, that's written by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, who are comparative politics scholars at Harvard University. And essentially what they do is they look at a whole bunch of advanced democracies and those that have transitioned to and away from democracy over time, and look for common patterns among those countries. And essentially what they find is democratic institutions are, number one, the most important thing that holds democracies up. That's what defines a democracy. But what reinforces those institutions are the norms, these collective behaviors that the elites and others in society and the participants in society adhere to or not. And as those norms devolve, it undercuts democracy and weakens the foundation of democracy. And there's two particular norms that they really hone in on that I think are most important to address here. The first is what they call mutual toleration, which is the idea that essentially political rivals respect one another, that whoever is your political opposite, that you essentially respect their right to participate in the political sphere. And the other one is known as forbearance. Which is the idea that when you have power, you don't use all of your power. You show some sense of restraint. And so regardless of the technical terms here, I think you can just think of these as respect and restraint. When political rivals fail to engage in both mutual respect of one another and some restraint when they hold power, then it degrades the ability of democratic institutions to properly function. And so that degradation of norms in the United States is one of the results of worsening polarization in the US. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more here about polarization and how that has contributed to this degradation of norms that we're talking about. But to cut to the chase a little bit, where this is going is to essentially say that when people are threatened by their adversaries, if you think your political opponent is literally dangerous to you, then you are less likely to want to compromise with them or to cede power to them. And so it reduces the incentives to engage in compromise, to engage in good faith negotiations between one another. And so that's how polarization results in the degradation of democratic norms. Okay, so that's a little bit about where we are, and yes, I think we do need some saving. I'm not going to go all through all the ways in which we're breaking those norms right now, but talking about how 2020 is different gets into it a little bit. So let me go to that second point next. So first, the election in 2020, as you all are very well aware, has a number of unique features. So the first is, it is the first time in American history that American voters have the opportunity to re-elect a president who was impeached by the House of Representatives. Of course, Donald Trump was not removed by the Senate, but he was impeached and he is standing for re-election. Moreover, his approval ratings are remarkably stable. So this is a graph that shows his popularity ratings, or his approval ratings rather, over the course of his entire presidency. And his approval rating, Donald Trump's approval rating has essentially never been above 50%. It hovers around 42% or so, give or take. And nothing, remarkably, I think, even in the face of pandemic and in great crisis, or all sorts of events that have happened, the approval rating is remarkably stable. So this is a byproduct of polarization and political identity that we really haven't seen in previous presidential administrations. So it speaks to the extreme polarization in the electorate, which is another unique feature of 2020. Polarization, as I'll show in a second, has been increasing across time, really over the last 40 years. And we're coming to a peak. Like every year it's getting worse and worse. And so that means while we have done elections under conditions of polarization, we've never done it under conditions of the extreme level of polarization that we have now. And then, of course, we're living under a pandemic that makes this election unique. And then we have widespread racial justice protests. And this also greatly colors the way people think about political activism and activity and participation. And we can use that. I'm going to give you some data to show how we can think about that with relation to the election. Okay, so how does all of this help us think about political dysfunction in the United States? So the big source of all of this, if I can point to one thing, what I would point to is inequality. And I'm not going to go into all the ways in which we get various forms of inequality, but we can talk about income inequality, we can talk about racial inequality, we can talk about injustice with respect to different sorts of social classes and categories of rights. But when you get more extreme inequality in a free society, it creates the conditions for partisan polarization. And as polarization worsens, it creates the conditions for gridlock because people don't want to compromise with the other side. And as gridlock gets worse, that contributes to the decline of democratic norms that I was just talking about. And as norms decline and values and democratic values decline, it tends to worsen inequality. And so this is the cycle of dysfunction that America is sort of stuck in now, that starts in the mid to early 1970s. And then, of course, you take all of this and you add on top of it a pandemic, and it just heightens all of these effects. Particularly, the pandemic has a really strong effect on exacerbating inequality in the United States, particularly over income and race. Okay, so we get inequality, it leads to polarization. This graph, I'm not going to explain it fully, but it goes over the last 150 or so years that describes increasing polarization in the House and the Senate. So the vertical scale there is the difference between the median Democrat and the median Republican in the House and the Senate, and the higher up you are on that scale, the greater the distance between the parties. So both in the US House and in the US Senate, we've seen increasing polarization. And as you can see in this graph, that trend starts in the 1970s, right? So this is not caused by Donald Trump, although his efforts to exacerbate it have been quite successful. And it's not caused by any of the Clintons or Obamas or anything like that. It's really deeply rooted in American political institutions and society. And it goes back to a number of policy choices and other social effects that occurred in the 1970s in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. This is a different, and actually I might skip this graph because it's sort of showing the same thing as the other one in a different form, showing that congressional polarization is worsening over time. So let me just move on. In addition to having greater polarization among elected officials or political elites, as I usually call them, we also have increasing polarization among the general public. So this is data from the Pew Research Center showing that just over the last 25 years, we have seen the median Democrat and the median Republican in the general public also get further and further apart. And the top three graphs are the increasing polarization among people who are more politically engaged. And the lower graph is among those who are less engaged. So polarization is worse among people who pay more attention to politics and who are more active in politics and who are voters, right? So we're more likely to see polarization among, for example, folks who participate in the League of Women Voters or other type of civic organizations. Okay, so another way that we can look at polarization is its relationship to income inequality. The big take-home point here is that since about 1980, which is where these graphs really turn, you can see, since 1980, the upper 1% of income earners in the United States have seen their income increase by over 50%, and the bottom 50% of income earners have seen their income cut in half over the same time period. So we have had extreme income inequality that is exacerbated by all sorts of tax policies and other types of things that we're not going to have time to get into today. But this worsening income inequality contributes to political polarization. Okay, so let me sum up a couple of these points before we go on. So partisanship is becoming an increasing part of people's political identity. So we used to think of individual identity as being mostly driven by race and gender. You know, if you think of who you are and what makes you identify with others, we usually think about things like race and gender, sometimes religion and class as being a part of that, but increasingly partisanship, the party that you associate with, is of the greatest salience. And as partisans diverge, in other words, as polarization increases, those partisans start to see the world through different lenses. So they agree on fewer shared facts. They start to feel threatened by the other group. The cost of losing an election to the other side increases because they are further and further apart from one another. And that threat of loss heightens the sense of intensity and threat that people feel from one another. So as this threat increases and the costs of losing increases, we get increased willingness to use violence as a way to win elections. And so all of this is a sort of self-perpetuating form of partisan polarization that we see happening in the United States today. Of course, when you add the pandemic to this, it heightens all of these effects I'm talking about, because it heightens economic inequality through the economic downturn. It increases public anxiety in general. It creates downward pressure on the incumbent party to respond to crisis. And of course, public gatherings are discouraged in the face of COVID-19, but we usually think of voting as a public gathering event. And so it's non-trivial to convert to vote by mail across the country. This is a difficult thing logistically to do. And voting by mail is encouraged. It's safe and secure. I don't need to convince anybody here, I think, of that. But the President of the United States, who has the largest platform of any speaker in the United States, stokes uncertainty about voting by mail. And so that contributes to a sense of insecurity that people have about how to participate in politics during the pandemic. Okay, let me go to racial protest and how racial protest affects the 2020 elections. Quite remarkably, coincidentally, there was a wonderful study published in the flagship journal of political science, the American Political Science Review, just earlier this year by a scholar at Princeton University named Omar Wasow, who studied the protest movements of the 1960s and how various acts of protest during that time period affected election outcomes in that time period. And it just makes a wonderful parallel to what we're living through today. And so there's two ways we could look at this. We might ask, do protests indicate a liberal surge? So the more that there are protests about racial injustice, does that mean that we're going to see greater activism from liberals? Or does racial justice demonstrations stimulate white backlash? And does that mean we should see a stimulated conservative vote in the face of greater racial injustice? And the answer that he comes up with really is that it depends. And what it depends on is how people perceive the protests. Do they perceive them as violent, or do they perceive them as nonviolent? So there's a lot going on in this graph, so let me just try to break it down here. Essentially, the x-axis shows the county level change in Democratic vote share across time. And so that means that if you are on the upper side of this zero line here in the positive space, these are counties that were more likely to vote for Democrats in the 1964 to 1972 period. And so what he shows is that areas or counties that experienced nonviolent protest were more likely to vote for Democrats, whereas areas that experienced violent protest were less likely to vote for Democrats. So what it means is we see protests surging for liberals and for racial conservatives, but how that surge happens is entirely dependent on people's perception. So this is where how the media talks about the Black Lives Matter movement and what goes on in the various racial justice protests that happen around the country, how those are portrayed in the media may have an effect on the election, because if they're portrayed as riotous and destructive, then it's more likely that we'll get white backlash voters turning out. But if it's portrayed as largely peaceful and sympathetic, then it's more likely to lead to greater racial justice sympathizers turning out to vote. Okay, to address this question of the information environment, this is also data from the Pew Research Center that I compiled the other day that shows, I think in a really nice tight way, how Republicans and Democrats just live in different worlds. They live in different information environments. And Pew has a wonderful set of data about media consumption broken down by party. But on this particular question, what they were asking was whether or not people think voting by mail is a safe way to vote, or if it contributes to voter fraud. So is voter fraud a problem when it comes to voting by mail? And what you can see here is that among Republicans, they tend to see it are more likely to see it as a major or even minor problem. And among Democrats, Democrats are much more likely to say that it is not a problem to vote by mail. And so the idea that Republicans are more afraid of the fraud in this format and Democrats are not, just to me emphasizes the different information environments and the different signals that these two categories of voters are getting from the elites that they listen to. All right. I'm going to move on to point 3, which is to get to sort of the meat of the question here about the purpose of voting in elections. And so to do this, I'm going to talk quickly about 3 political science theories that help us understand why people vote. So I'm going to call them folk theory, spatial theory, and social theory. So with respect to folk theory, there's this idea of democracy that's rather romantic. And it's summarized really nicely in this book by Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels in 2017, in which they talk about this conventional wisdom or the folk theory of democracy. That is basically the idea that the reason democracy works is because we use elections to hold representatives accountable. And that incentive from voters makes the representatives more likely to enact policies that voters want, right? So voters elect leaders who enact policy, and then voters respond to that policy. And if they like it, they re-elect the leaders. And if they don't like it, they don't re-elect the leaders. And those incentives basically create the accountability structure within a democracy. This is the sort of dream, the folk theory, the fantasy about democracy that we're all taught, I think, from a young age about why democracy works. And I'm here to tell you that this is essentially wrong. This is essentially not how democracies work. And here's why. There's some failures in this folk fantasy that we believe about democracy. And the problem is that most people don't pay attention to politics, hardly at all. Voters, when they go to cast their ballot, are strongly influenced by recent events. The thing that you ate for breakfast that morning, the people that you talked to while you're waiting in line to vote, the crisis that happened 3 weeks before the election, things that happened recently are much more likely to influence the vote choice that a voter makes in the ballot box. So they don't tend to look at in a holistic way, the whole course of an incumbent's political record over the course of their time in office. Rather, they're influenced by these recent events. And so in this way, election outcomes are not determined by voters holding incumbents accountable. Rather, they're much more determined by partisan loyalty, by cognitive biases that we all have because we're just humans with flawed brains, and by these partisan identities and other social identities that we hold that strongly influence our vote choice, much more so than this idea that we're using our vote choice to hold people accountable. Okay, so folk theory has got some flaws in it. Another theory about how and why people vote comes essentially from an economics view of politics that was developed in the 1950s. And it's the idea that we can think of candidates and voters on a one-dimensional liberal conservative spectrum. And if we think of all candidates and voters on this spectrum, then candidates will position themselves to attract the most voters possible. And what this does is it provides voters an incentive to vote for the candidate that is them ideologically on this scale. And so this gets turned into this theorem called the median voter theorem. And mathematically, we can prove that this is correct. But functionally, it doesn't always work out this way. So the basic idea here is that if you've got candidate A and candidate B, and they're on this left-right spectrum, that all of the voters will vote for the candidate nearest them. So all of the blue candidates will vote for A, and all the red voters will vote for B. And the folks in the middle there are going to vote for the one that is closest to them, which provide candidates an incentive to move closer to the middle of the spectrum in order to maximize the number of voters that they attract. Okay, but we also have some failures in this model. What if voting is really costly? Because it turns out it is. And what if everybody doesn't vote? It turns out they don't. What if voters have trouble identifying where the candidates are on this spectrum? That can be tricky because they change their minds a lot. What if the candidates aren't static? What if they move around and give different messages to different audiences? What if the candidate nearest you just rubs you the wrong way? You just aren't you don't find them appealing for whatever reason. You can't have a beer with them, whatever weird things people use these days. When these things fail, then it means the spatial model doesn't have this neat equilibrium outcome and doesn't fully describe the way people vote. Okay, so the theory of voting in elections that I want to advance is what I'm going to call the social model of voting. And this comes from a bunch of literature, and actually there's a really wonderful piece, and I'll try to link it when we're done with the talk, in the New York Times today. And I forget the journalist that wrote the piece, but it's got a picture of Robert Putnam in the front. But it's all about this idea of the spatial model of voting. And it comes from scholars like Meredith Rolfe and Betsy Sinclair and Liliana Mason, who essentially describe that any individual's decision to vote is never made in isolation. We all have, in this sense, a lot less individual agency than we tend to think we do. But rather, our decision to vote and how to vote are strongly dependent on the social context in which we live. That is, the people we work with and talk about politics with, and the information that we get exposed to. And so in this way, the predictors of voting have much more to do with having a large personal network, having a greater level of education, being older, having a really a severe stake in the outcome of the election, having strong roots in your community, being partisan, being asked to vote by another human being personally, and also being white and being wealthy. All of these are predictors of voting, not because of anything inherent about those particular characteristics or attributes themselves, but because of the way they feed into this social context of interdependence that describes the powers, the various decisions that we make about how to vote. Okay, so let me try to draw things to a close here. So why do people vote? They vote as an expression of their social identity. They vote for a sense of solidarity with others with whom they feel connected. And they vote out of a sense of civic connection, civic duty, this civic socialness of connectivity as an act of democratic self-governance that we do as a community. Why do we have elections? Well, one reason we have elections is because it's not democracy otherwise. And the reason it's important to value democracy is because it's the only system of government humans have ever invented that has the greatest possibility of providing the most liberty and the most equality to the most people under some perfect ideal conditions. And so if we don't have elections, then we can't have democracy. It's a necessary condition. Elections also provide a sense of legitimacy, even if it's not full accountability for elected representatives. And we also have elections so that we can feel represented by the people that we elect, so that we can feel connected to them in some way. All right, so let me try to answer the question that we started with at the beginning here after all of this. So elections can save us if we let them, I think is how I'm going to try to tie this up. Democratic institutions are under threat. I think American democracy is at its most precarious position that it has been for anybody who is now alive today. And I can talk more about that if you want and what I think that might mean. But elections at the end of the day are a form of local, and by that I want to remind everybody here that we do not have national elections in the United States at all for anything. We don't do national referendum. We don't elect the president by a national popular vote. We use the Electoral College. Everything is state, county, or local elections, period. So local elections are a local event. They are a social event. They are a form of civic action that can create a bond between citizens who are connected with one another in some way. And so at the end of the day, alone, elections are not sufficient. They are necessary, but they are not sufficient to help democracy endure. But with some sustained attention to democratic norms, to democratic values, and to our common bonds, I think participating in elections can set us on the right path. Okay, and I've gone on too long and I've thrown too much at you, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop there, and I'm happy to take your questions. Mom, you're going to want to unmute as you moderate this. There you go.
Yeah. So, I
if people just want to raise their hands, I can, or I see there is one hand raised here. Oh, wait, maybe it went down.
I'm wondering, I've seen a couple of people raise their hands and I wasn't sure why or how I could help them. And I'm still kind of not sure about that. And I wonder what's going on with the Q&A because I'm not questions there.
Can you maybe see that panelists are others able to turn their mics on to ask questions?
I can turn their mics on. So whose hand, you saw Karen Rosenthal's hand?
I don't know whose hand was raised.
Ah. If I turn them all on, they'll all come on the screen. Karen, you can I think you can unmute yourself, can you?
I did.
Go ahead and ask a question.
Actually, I thought I had a question, but then I realized it wasn't perfectly formed. So give me a few minutes.
Okay.
No problem.
Cindy has her hand raised. So I don't know what is wrong with the settings here. Seems like every time I do this, some setting is wrong. I'm looking for Cindy in the list of people here.
If you want, you could stop making me a co-host and make Tammy a co-host, and maybe she could, I don't know if that helps you or not, but.
What happened to, are you there, Cindy? This is very frustrating. I'm sorry about this for everybody here.
It looks
Hear
like
me now?
she's unmuted, but I can't hear her.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh,
Go
okay. All right. My question is pretty simple. Is there an example of violence created that is a result of an election or intimidation of people who vote by the Democratic Party?
Wait a second. I want to make sure I understand your question correctly. Do you mean throughout history, or do you mean like in contemporary times?
Contemporary times.
Contemporary
Obviously, when we get back to the civil rights, I mean to the slavery issue, yes. Contemporary times in the last 50 years.
Examples of violence associated with elections. Sure, there are.
The ones that I'm Democratic Party.
Right. So the ones that I'm thinking of are, of course, the famous riots in 1968 in the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Maybe that's going too far back. Maybe you mean something a little bit more modern. But we typically in the United States have not seen violence associated with the election itself. Now, we do see all sorts of barriers that are put into place to voting, and all sorts of intimidation strategies that have gone on. So the way that I think about voting rights in the United States, and I didn't get into this in the talk, but this provides me an opportunity to here, is that one of the markers that most scholars use to understand whether or not a country is a democracy is the proportion of the adult population that has voting rights. So at the time of the founding of the country, when the Constitution's ratified in the 1780s, only about 6% of the adults of population was able to have voting rights, right? So it was very small. So a lot of scholars would say that's not a democracy, in fact. Or you might say it was a very weak democracy, or something that had the ideal of democracy but wasn't fully formed. As you go through the 1800s, voting rights expands. By the time you get to the Civil War, most white men are able to vote. And then in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, the vote is expanded to many African Americans for a period of about 11 years or so. But then the era of Jim Crow. Often the way voting rights go in the United States is it gets expanded and then there's a period of backlash, especially with respect to racial justice. So we see periods of advanced racial justice, and then we see periods of backlash against that. So the period of Reconstruction, where we saw advanced racial justice, was followed by a long period of Jim Crow in the South that was extreme backlash and filled with lots of violence. And that period doesn't really end until the 1960s. Of course, as you know, women are guaranteed the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, but it's important to remember that that's really only for white women. So women of color are still very much disenfranchised in many areas of the country, even after the passage of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But in 1965, things change a lot. The passage of the Voting Rights Act supersedes even the constitutional amendments in the 15th, and provides the expansion of suffrage rights to more Americans than had ever been at that point. So, and the period between 1965 and about the mid-1990s was sort of the peak of democracy in the United States, where the most people had the most voting rights and the most representation. And since the mid-1990s, we've had some, again, backslide. It takes a particularly bad turn in 2013 with the Supreme Court case Shelby County versus Holder, which undercuts Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, if you're familiar with that. That has so basically, for the last 20 years, we have legal conditions that allow states to do things like enact various forms of voter ID laws and do other things that put barriers in the way to people voting. So in that sense, we had a peak of democracy in the 1980s and 1990s, and we've been on a more downward slope since then. It's not as bad as it was, I think, in 1800s in terms of democracy. We have a lot more voting rights now. But your question is specifically about violence. And while I think the extreme polarization that we have in the United States it creates the potential conditions for violence, and we have seen some of that in some of the racial justice protests. The thing that if anything's going to keep me up at night, it's going to be the legitimacy of the institutions, right? So at the end of the day, democracy isn't necessarily about whoever gets the most votes wins. It is often about that, but not always. We have lots of democratic institutions that aren't majoritarian. Rather, what makes a democracy is that we all agree on the rules. We all agree to elect the president by the Electoral College. We may not like it, we may be critical of it, but we agree that whichever person wins that becomes the president, right? So even though in 2000 and in 2016 and in 3 elections in the 1800s, we had the popular vote winner being different than the Electoral College vote winner, people accepted it. By and large, most Americans said, yes, the rules say that person is the winner. I accept the rules that, so that means Bush won in 2000 and Trump won in 2016. If that changes, if people feel that the threat of the other side winning is so severe that they stop accepting the rules as the legitimate outcome and their faith in the system is ultimately dissipated, then that's where you get the real conditions for violence and the real undercutting of democratic institutions. And so I think the fear in 2020 is that whichever side wins, the losing side will feel so threatened as to find reasons not to believe the result of the election and act out as a result of that.
There are more questions have come up in the question box. I'm confused about why things are going the way they are, but that's okay.
Maybe people just aren't asking questions.
Well, there are a couple more hands raised, so I think they just for some reason can't put it in the question box. Anyway, here's another question. what are ways to mitigate the polarization due to people living in such different information environments, little common understanding of facts?
This is a great question, and it's a huge question. And I think there's a lot of answers to this question. And in a way, I think I put it into two big buckets. So one big bucket of a way to address polarization is institutional reform, right? So if some of the political inequality that we are experiencing today as a result of malapportionment in the Electoral College and the Senate, as a result of the vestiges of American colonialization of various territories that don't have full voting rights, and other factors, you could think about big institutional changes to the structure of our democracy that would make people feel more represented. So that might be expanding the size of the House of Representatives. That might be making structural changes to the Senate. That might be adding DC and Puerto Rico as a state and releasing other territories as either bringing them in as states or not making them colonies anymore, essentially, or territories. It might mean moving to ranked choice voting, as some states and localities have done. It might mean moving to multi-member districts. So rather than electing a single member of Congress from your district, you would elect multiple members of Congress from your district, which would create the conditions for multiple parties to exist. But all of those are big institutional changes to the structure and the function of democracy. So that's one answer. Those are really hard changes to make. We may be on the footing for them. We may be going in that direction eventually, but of course they're fraught and get polarized themselves, those discussions. The other bucket that I think is a way to think about how to start addressing polarization is to use policy. Rather than big institutional changes, use policy changes to try to get at the sources of polarization. So since we know that inequality is one of the chief sources of polarization, if we enacted changes to tax law and changes to laws addressing racial justice and changes to laws addressing inequality in education and healthcare and environmental justice, all of these types of regulations and taxations and so forth that you can think of could be done in such a way as to try to level the playing field, as to try to reduce the extreme inequalities that exist in some of those sectors. Of course, those policies would also be controversial and fraught, but some of them you could do at the local level instead of the national level, right? So it's one answer to how to address polarization is stop trying to fix it in Congress and just try to fix it in your neighborhood, right? Like just get really local about finding points of connection within communities and enacting local community policy, like find the sources of inequality in your community and start talking about local policies that could be addressed that might help alleviate some of those inequalities. And this might come down to stuff like local zoning laws about how and where we build residences and things like that, that we know have contributed to racial segregation over the years. So those are my two big bucket answers to those questions.
And the next question, it's from Jan Bush. I'm sure she doesn't mind that I say her name. She says that it's a pleasure to see Barbara's passion for civic life picked up by her daughter. This is so cool, Jennifer. But she has a question. What happened in the 1970s that triggered the shift to polarization conditions? And thank you for speaking to us today.
Yeah, so a couple of things happened at that time that prompted this. And of course, one of them I've already talked about, and that has to do with income inequality. There were changes to various forms of taxation and so forth that occurred in the 1970s and also the 1980s that contributed to that income inequality problem. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it that is a big source of the story here that we haven't really addressed here has to do with political parties. So in the 1950s and 60s, we have the civil rights movement. And if you think about American politics during the middle of the 20th century, what you had was a Democratic Party and a Republican Party that both contained liberalism and conservatism. So in the Democratic Party, you had Southern conservatives that held on to that Democratic Party ID as a vestige from Civil War times. That was very much a beholden part of their identity. You know, these were the yellow dog Democrats. They would vote for a yellow dog before they would not vote for a Democrat. Democrat, right? But they were conservatives. They were racial conservatives. Many of them were economic liberals, but they were racial conservatives, but they had the Democratic Party ID. But through the New Deal coalition that FDR creates in the 1930s and 40s, we start to see a little bit more move towards racial justice and economic liberalism and so forth. And so that coalition of Democrats has elements of liberalism and conservatism. And likewise on the Republican side, I won't go into the details, but they also have elements of liberalism and conservatism. And because ideology is cross-cutting in the middle part of the 20th century between the two political parties, it creates the conditions for bipartisanship. It allows them to find points of common interest. Our political institutions are strongly structured by political parties. But the way the Constitution is written, it assumes parties aren't there. This is one of the mismatched problems that we have. And because we have partisanship in our, for example, the way Congress makes laws, partisanship is very important, the way Congress is organized. If you have ideology mixed within the parties, it creates the conditions for the parties to make coalitions across one another. So you get bipartisan coalitions. But what we have today, as you go through the advance through the civil rights movement in the 1960s, essentially what happens is the white backlash to the civil rights movement, the white conservative backlash to the civil rights movement starts in 1968 really with Richard Nixon. In his campaign, he explicitly creates what becomes known as the Southern Strategy. And the Southern Strategy was an explicit appeal to white racial conservatives in the South to convince them that they no longer belonged in the Democratic Party and they should come into the Republican Party. And this process essentially takes a whole generation to complete, all through the 70s, 80s, and by the time you get to the mid-90s, it's more or less complete. But that generation more or less has to die out. Those party labels are really strongly part of people's identity. But ultimately, then what happens is the parties reorganize, starting in the 1970s, as a result of how things shift in the civil rights movement. And now what we have are parties organized completely by ideology. Liberals are Democrats, conservatives are Republicans. And when I tell this to my students these days, they were like, well, of course, how else could it be? That's how it is. That's what defines party. But in reality, it's weird. Like it's an aberration in the history of American politics to have our political parties so neatly organized by ideology. And because of that, it makes it so that it makes it very difficult to make bipartisan coalitions across the parties, which our constitutional structure, our lawmaking structure actually requires. So that's why we have gridlock.
Okay, I don't see any more Q&A, any more questions in the Q&A. Oh, Karen raised her hand. I'm starting to think that the reason this is different is because it has more to do with the device that people are on. Can you try to talk now, Karen? Can you unmute yourself?
I just unmuted myself, and I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yes.
My question is actually a subsequent question to what she just explained about the parties changing roles and whatever. When did nonpartisan elections occur or be mandated in local politics? For example, we're having a school board election, we're having a community college election, we're having a city council election, and there's been some discussion, not much, about what role party politics should play in these allegedly nonpartisan elections. Can you give a little explanation of that?
Yeah, so in my mind, one of the problems is that people, I think, instinctively understand that we have partisan polarization in the United States and that it's bad. And they think that means parties are bad. And so we have sort of this general disdain for political parties just as institutions. But in reality, parties and partisanship are two different things. They are very different things, in fact. And so, but what we know about political parties, you know, the framers of the Constitution thought that parties were evil. They were going to be violent factions, and they tried to do everything they could to build a system that wouldn't need parties, that would have other checks on power. And essentially they failed. And the reason they failed is because political parties are inevitable in a democracy. They're in fact essential institutions to democracy. So in my mind, the framers made two huge mistakes. One was they assumed parties wouldn't form and they built the institutions under that assumption. And the second was they didn't deal with slavery. And those are the biggest flaws in the Constitution, in my mind. But in any case, because parties and partisanship are different things, it means that when reformers, who I think have the best of intentions of trying to create local procedures and elections and policies that will benefit a community, they think that it's better to do that in a nonpartisan way because partisanship is so diseased. When in reality, what we know about political parties is that they help organize a democracy. They solve collective action problems for a democracy. If we think of the other political party as diseased and evil, then it's harder to think of parties as a good thing. But if we think of political parties as innocuous political institutions whose function it is to help coordinate political civic action, right? It's good for voters because it helps them find who other voters are like, and so they can campaign with them. And it's good for candidates because when voters and candidates both have party ID, you know who you're closest to vote for when you go to the ballot box. There's all sorts of collective action problems that are solved because political parties exist. And we can't outlaw parties, it doesn't work. And so in my mind, we're better off enacting reforms that actually strengthen political parties. And I realize that sounds counterintuitive because we all want there to be less stringent partisanship. But what I can tell you is that when we look at analyses across different states and those that have, for example, laws related to campaign finance, states that use campaign finance laws that empower political parties to do more, play a stronger role in the system, versus states that have campaign finance laws where parties are much less empowered, the states where the parties are more empowered are less polarized. And the reason for that is because parties are a natural antidote to extremism. That might sound weird, but I swear to you that a political party as sort of the living organism of sorts, as a coalition, knows that it's more likely to get people elected when they don't have extremists, right? So if you think about a primary and you've got an extremist and a moderate, if more of the partisans are attracted to the moderate than the extremist, then the party should gravitate towards nominating that moderate. Parties in that way have an incentive to elect more moderate candidates or nominate more moderate candidates rather than extremists. And so in my mind, enacting all sorts of reforms that would strengthen political parties would help to reduce political extremism.
I don't see any other questions, and I don't see oh wait, here comes another question. Let's see. Are the upcoming generations less susceptible to the polarization?
Unfortunately, I would say no. The conditions that have created polarization that we have in the United States are deep. They are structural, right? They go back 40 or 50 years. And so until we change those conditions in some way, polarization is going to continue to exacerbate. So we are in a cycle now where it's really incumbent on us, I think, to value democratic institutions, democratic values, democratic norms, and to make both institutional and policy-oriented changes at the national and local level that reflect a value for democracy. Like, one of the things I think that's going on in the United States these days is that there are a number of partisans and elected folks who frankly don't believe in democracy anymore. They don't follow the democratic norms. And we don't follow the democratic norms, and you don't use political rhetoric that supports democratic values, then you don't believe in democracy anymore. And I didn't get into this aspect of polarization, but the data very clearly tell us that that sense of lack of respect for democratic norms and is what we call asymmetric across the political parties. That is, we have more anti-small d democracy feeling attitude in the Republican Party than we do in the Democratic Party. There's more extremism among Republicans than there is among Democrats, although extremism is present in both parties. And so what we need is for all partisans, regardless of where they are on the spectrum, to recommit themselves to democratic principles and those norms that I was talking about. And until we do that, it'll probably continue to get worse, I'm afraid.
Can you share your thoughts on the possibilities of the value of developing more than two strong political parties?
Yeah, I have kind of mixed thoughts about this. So one of the things, one problem that we've got is that the average size of a congressional district in the United States is 750,000 people, right? So 750,000 people is a huge district for a single member of Congress to represent. And so I think there's one of the reasons I think people clamor for more political parties is that they don't feel particularly well represented by the parties that we've got. And so that, to me, says what we need to do is enact reforms that make people feel more closely tied to their representative, like strengthen the link between electeds and citizens. And that can come in a lot of different forms. If we want to make reforms that will do it in terms of creating more parties, that might work out okay. The downside is you got more parties, you're probably going to get more gridlock, because it actually then makes it more complicated to build coalitions that are majorities to pass policy. So it could make things even more stagnant than they are. But if they didn't, if the goal was just more parties and there were other reforms that we're going to try to work on the gridlock part, then what you would need to do is change the election laws, right? So what leads to two political parties is the fact that we use a plurality rule, so whoever gets the most votes wins, and single member districts for Congress. And it's that system, that plurality rule, single member district system, that tends to produce two political parties. So you have to change that system in order to create more parties in the United States. So that's where we start talking about using systems like ranked choice voting and using multi-member districts that create the possibilities of more political parties. And we see this in some state legislatures, right? So there are a handful of state legislatures in the United States that use some multi-member districts for some of their seats. And we can see some of that working a little bit more away from some polarization trends, although the evidence there is a little bit mixed.
The next one is, thank you for your insight. Can you speak more about today's respect and the person didn't get the second word in there, but I think the two words you were talking about.
Respect and restraint.
Right.
Are democratic norms that are the most important ones that that scholars talk about these days. And so, I'm sorry, the question was about, speak more about people's tendency
today's, to how respect and restraint in today's political environment, I think is what she meant.
Okay, so on the one hand, we have seen respect and restraint being violated in lots of points in American history, right? So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to run for re-election a third time, you know, he served almost 4 full terms as president. That was a huge violation of democratic norms, right? The norm was presidents serve 2 terms. And so when FDR decided to violate that norm, that was a violation of restraint. That was him showing not, you know, a lack of restraint of maintaining his grip on power, essentially. And so that's just one example. But we have seen lots of examples through US history of violations of this respect and restraint norm. The problem that we've got today is that I think we see more violations on the respect side than the restraint side. And the rhetoric that Donald Trump uses as president is, you know, part of his appeal. The coalition of voters that are most attracted to him are attracted to his lack of respect, right? It's a part of his brand. You know, he announced his candidacy for the presidency by insulting Mexicans and calling them criminals. You know, he, you know, talks in vulgar terms about women. This is a part of his brand. And so, and he's just doubled down on all of that. You know, there was this idea that maybe he would grow into the presidency or act more sort of mature at some point, but that's not ever going to happen. This is who he is. You know, who's got the saying, when people show you who they are, you should believe them. And when you have the president of the United States who's engaged in that lack of respect, it creates permission for other people to behave the same way. Right? So we talk about this in terms of, in communication studies, we talk about it in terms of media effects and elite messaging. So when elites say stuff, that is when elected leaders say things, it gives them more credibility, it gives them more amplification, people are more likely to believe it. So when President Trump says things that are outright wrong, when he disagrees with the CDC about wearing masks, when he, you know, insults women or people of color, those are all examples of him engaging in that lack of respect and it getting amplified and in a permissive way so that others feel feel sort of comfortable going into that space as well. The other aspect of this that feeds this sort of two worlds part of respect and restraint is the media environment. And we didn't get into all of this here, but it's another part of the polarization puzzle. And some scholars trace it back to some of the regulations that we changed with respect to media in the 1980s. I know there's sort of a cadre out there that want to say it's social media's fault and social media has polarized us, and social media does make things worse and it does contribute to polarization. We've got pretty good evidence for that. But we've also got good evidence that changing the FCC regulations related to media ownership that allowed Fox News to build this giant conglomerate that they've got now, and the sort of equal time laws that have gone by the wayside in a lot of ways. All of this sort of lack of regulation in the media environment also contributes to polarization, because what you have now, and the Pew data shows this really nicely, is that those on the political right are more likely to live in a homogenous echo chamber where something like 60 to 70% of Republicans get their news from a single source, from something in the Fox News empire, whereas Democrats are much more likely to get their news from varied sources. And some of those sources are still very liberal leaning. It's not to say they're not necessarily in an echo chamber. But if our goal is to learn to respect or maintain the norm of respect of the other side, it is important to have variety in our news diet and to be getting our news from different sources and to be able to differentiate information from entertainment, which we really do a bad job of doing these days. Both on and actually that problem is more on the liberal side than the conservative side, I would argue.
I don't see any more hands raised or questions at the moment. And we're, oh wait, one question came up. Oh, it's just a thank you from Jeanette. Thank you for being here, Jeanette. I'll just say to Jennifer that Jeanette, who just asked this last question, is the president of the local NAACP, and we are happy to have her among us today. Thank you, Jeanette. Okay, I think that's it. And our hour is up. I want to thank all of the participants who came today. Once again, remind you of our October 4th Pro and Con event. If you have any questions about it or how you can get the video, you feel free to email us. And thank you for being here. I think we're done.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you all.
Oh, I should thank Jennifer. Jennifer, thank you for being here and doing this for us.
Very welcome.